Good morning. It's Monday, March 24th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 535 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Lots of headlines this morning. A 75-year-old man was killed in a vehicular terrorist attack in the lower Galilee region of Israel. A new Egyptian ceasefire proposal is now on the table. And as we understand it, both Hamas and Israel are not rejecting it outright. But here's what I'm watching carefully. Even more domestic tumult in Israel over the weekend. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned dismissal of Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar continues to roil the Israeli left. And now there's even more fury as the Bibi government looks to fire the Attorney General of Israel. All of this amidst investigations into Netanyahu aides for allegedly taking money from the Qataris. I'm watching the opposition's calls for a general strike that could paralyze Israel and render the country vulnerable amidst a multi-front war with Iranian proxies that has not only returned, but appears to be heating up in certain places. There's still room to de-escalate, and the Egyptian proposal may help us get there, but the window gets smaller every day the fighting drags on. We're going to keep tracking all of this right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest today is Stephen Cook. He's now a repeat offender here on our little program. He's got a lot to say about the U.S., Middle East, foreign policy, and Turkish politics. He's the Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He writes a column for Foreign Policy and has authored several books, including his latest called The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Stephen was one of the very first people I met here in Washington a few years ago. And maybe I should also note that he's the owner of a very sweet golden retriever named Tulip. My conversation with Stephen is coming up in about as much time as it takes the Turkish government to arrest a few hundred lawful protesters outside the presidential palace in Ankara. So stay tuned for that. Did Israel make the right choice by returning to war last week? Here's my take. First, Israel had no choice. There was no way Israel could agree to a permanent ceasefire that leaves Hamas as power brokers in Gaza. Doing so would be pre-10-7 thinking. It all comes down to Israel's stated war aims. Both ending Hamas rule and releasing the remaining hostages may not be feasible, I'm sorry to say. But if you tracked the news this weekend, you probably saw the IDF took out 2 more senior Hamas operatives. It hammered military targets in Syria to reduce future threats. And after rockets were fired out of Lebanon, significant Hezbollah assets were also destroyed. My concern remains focused on those Houthi ballistic missiles. I worry about the total number of missile defense interceptors that Israel has left. That number is key to Israel's security as this next phase of the war extends into its second week. Some possible good news. The U.S. campaign to weaken the Houthis seemed to be working. The Red Sea may be finally open to maritime traffic, but how much longer until the Houthis say uncle? I can't say for sure. The big news? An Israeli delegation just landed here last night in Washington for consultations on Iran with the White House. That's where the rubber hits the road, folks. We'll learn about that in another day or two. More to say on it soon, but until then, let's just acknowledge here that the fate of the Iranian regime could be hanging in the balance. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the U.S. military is beefing up its naval presence in the Middle East. By next month, there will be not 1, but 2 aircraft carriers in the region. According to reports, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth ordered the USS Harry Truman to remain in the Middle East for at least another month. The Truman has been conducting operations against the Houthis, and it was slated to head back to Norfolk, Virginia at the end of March. But now there's more firepower heading to the region. Hegseth ordered the USS Carl Vinson to make its way from the Pacific to the Middle East. The Vinson has been conducting exercises in the East China Sea with Japanese and South Korean forces. It was scheduled to return to San Diego in a few weeks. The vessel's arrival will now mark the second time in 6 months that the U.S. has had 2 carrier strike groups in the Middle East. Is this a signal to the Houthis and their patrons in Iran? You know it is. But will the administration do more than just signal? Let's wait and see, but I, for one, hope they do. Headline 2, the debate over the credibility of the Lebanese government is heating up again. On Saturday, 6 rockets were fired from Lebanon at the northern Israeli town of Metula. Israeli air defenses intercepted 3 of those, and the other 3 fell short and landed in Lebanese territory. No injuries were reported. Hezbollah denied responsibility for the attack, but even if it wasn't Hezbollah, the fingerprints of the Iranian regime were all over the attack, as my FDD colleagues always note. Sometimes Palestinian groups like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad fire rockets out of Lebanon, lending the Lebanese terrorist group a fig leaf of deniability. But let's be real. There are no military attacks against Israel out of South Lebanon that happen without Hezbollah's knowledge or approval. The big question now is whether the government can gain a handle on its own territory. Until it does, Israel will have to keep cleaning house. Reports this weekend suggest that the Lebanese armed forces stopped some smuggling on the Syrian border. But what's fascinating for me is that small but growing chorus of voices in Lebanon calling for an internationally recognized border with Israel or even normalization. Fascinating times here, folks. I'm not holding my breath, but this is new and maybe even cause for a tiny, tiny drop of optimism. And headline 3, protests are still raging in Turkey following the arrest of Istanbul's mayor last week, Turkey's top opposition leader. The mayor is Ekrem İmamoğlu, and he's the top rival of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, or as Stephen Cook calls him, Reggie. On the day of his arrest, İmamoğlu was slated to be nominated as the presidential candidate for Turkey's main opposition party. The Turkish people have since flooded the streets in more than a dozen cities across Turkey to protest the authoritarianism of their government. On Saturday, the Turkish Interior Minister said that authorities had detained 343 people on Friday night to prevent disrupting public order. That number, as I understand it, has now exceeded 1,100 arrests. Meanwhile, even as water cannons are hosing down protesters in Ankara, the government can't stop obsessing about Gaza. On Saturday, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan met with members of Hamas's Politburo. Senior Hamas chief Khalil al-Hayya led the delegation. Not many other details of the meeting were publicized, but the photo was enough for me. I continue to hold that Turkey is a state sponsor of terrorism. And now this week, the foreign minister of Turkey is heading to Washington. The Turks want to get permission to buy our advanced and coveted F-35 aircraft. I sincerely hope Secretary of State Marco Rubio sends the Turkish foreign minister home empty-handed on that request. All right. Now with that, let's turn to our discussion with Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen knows Turkey as well as anyone I know, so let's welcome him onto the show. Welcome to the program, Stephen Cook.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. All right, let's start with what happened last week. Why did Erdogan arrest opposition leader Ekrem İmamoğlu? And then what happened on the streets in Turkey?
Well, Erdogan arrested İmamoğlu basically because he can. He has been after the Istanbul mayor since 2019 when İmamoğlu became the mayor and beat Erdogan's handpicked candidate for that office actually twice. So they have been trying to undermine İmamoğlu ever since. I think the calculation in Ankara was essentially there'll be no price to pay in Washington from the White House as a result of taking down your Erdogan's major opposition leader and the likely presidential candidate. And at the same time, the Europeans have been talking about Turkey being more important to European security than ever before, and had been making nice with President Erdogan since they got the signal that the United States was backing away from NATO, changing its policy on Ukraine, however you want to describe it. And so Erdogan figured that he had the situation in Turkey wrapped up and wired. The only places he could possibly be penalized is in Washington or in Brussels. And now, with the situation changed in both places, he could move against İmamoğlu. He was wrong.
I think he was wrong. And I did note, by the way, that the French came out last night and started slamming Turkey for some of these authoritarian things that we've been watching. But now this week is big. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, former intelligence chief that really established those close ties with Hamas and Iran over the years, he's coming to Washington. What does he want? And will the Trump administration give him what he wants?
Well, there's two big things that Fidan is after. The first, and actually most important to President Erdogan, is a White House visit. He has been seeking to come to the White House. The Biden administration had set one up and then canceled it. They were concerned that Erdogan would embarrass the president over U.S. policy in Gaza. But Erdogan and Trump have a good personal relationship, unlike Biden and Erdogan. So Fidan's first request is a White House meeting. His second request is for the United States to allow Turkey back into the F-35 program. They were ejected over the S-400 purchase of this Russian air defense system that is designed to take down NATO aircraft, and that would provide an opportunity for Russian engineers to get inside the F-35, it was feared at the time. Now, S-400 is not the only issue that divides Turkey and the United States. There is, as you mentioned in your lead-in, Hamas. There is support for HTS, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. There are Russian sanctions. There are a whole host of issues. And now add to this issue, at least for Congress, which will want to have a say over the F-35, this massive repression of hundreds of thousands of Turks who are demanding that Ekrem İmamoğlu be released from prison and restored as the mayor of Istanbul. So it could be a very tough meeting, except for the fact that, as I said, Erdogan and Trump have a good personal relationship. And it was Trump who blamed President Obama for ejecting Turkey from the F-35 program, even though that happened under Trump's watch.
It did. Well, let's talk about that F-35 program and the drama. What happened back in 2019, and why is this even back in the picture? Why are we talking about it right now?
Yeah, it actually goes back much further than 2019. It has to do with Turkey's search for an air defense system. And the Turks originally wanted a Patriot air defense system, but they wanted the technology offsets that the United States doesn't give to anybody except perhaps the British and maybe the Israelis. But other than that, no one gets these kinds of technology offsets. And the United States said, no, we're not going to give you the Patriot system. And so the Turks turned to the Russians to buy the S-400 system. And for months and months and months, the United States warned Turkey that if you take delivery of the S-400, F-35 is over. They took delivery anyway, and the United States kicked the Turks out of the F-35 program, which was not just preventing them from buying the 100 jets that they had on order. Turkey was part of the supply chain, was manufacturing pieces of the F-35, which required a massive change in how this airplane is manufactured. We weathered that storm, and Turkey's been kept out of the F-35. Over towards the end of the Biden administration, Ambassador Jeff Flake started talking about a reset between Turkey and the United States. Turkey had allowed Sweden and Finland into NATO, had been constructive at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, but not really constructive thereafter. And so Flake, on his way out the door, started floating this idea of a return to the F-35. The Turks have latched onto it and have essentially said, let bygones be bygones. We're more important than we've ever been before for European security. You want us in the F-35 program.
And I guess we're hearing a couple of other things right now. One is that the Turks would agree to dismantle some small piece of the S-400, and that might be enough for this administration to say that the S-400 is no longer operable and therefore everything is kosher. That's one. The other thing that I've heard is that the Turks are trying to purchase an Italian company that has a role to play in the production of the F-35, and this would give them some kind of a backdoor entrance. I don't like any of it, but
now, I think this issue of we'll dismantle it, I would not trust the Turks on that at all. And the policy was, if you have the S-400, you don't have the F-35. And like I said, I think Congress is going to weigh in on this. Now, President Trump has a history of overriding Congress on these issues, but Congress has been the driver here on S-400, no F-35. Get rid of the S-400 lock, stock, and barrel, and we'll consider letting you back into the F-35 program. So it may be a fight
getting rid of it,
Capitol Hill and the White House.
Yeah, and getting rid of it, by the way, it's interesting because there are people who talked about handing it over to the Ukrainians, handing it over to the United States so that we could actually get under the hood and take a look at that technology and maybe defang it for future NATO aircraft. But let me just ask you, I mean, the S-400 saga is not the only beef we have with Turkey. You've already mentioned some of the challenges that we face. There's Hamas. There's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS in Syria. We've seen massive Iran sanctions evasion schemes. very large Russian sanction evasion schemes, and all kinds of other Turkish mischief, not to mention all the mess that we're watching domestically right now in Turkey. Are we ever going to see the U.S. crack down on any of this? It seems like our policy is just really mushy.
Our policy has long been mushy when it comes to Turkey. I mean, the Turks not only are, involved in a variety of underhanded schemes with the Iranians, Hamas, HTS, and so on and so forth in the Middle East, they have menaced co-NATO allied Turkey in the Aegean.
You mean Greece?
Yeah, Greece. What did I say?
You said Turkey.
Turkey has menaced Greece and menaced Cyprus, a member of the European Union, which it occupies. So this is sort of a kind of 360 problematic partner of the United States. And the problem is that it is a NATO ally, and the American foreign policy establishment, the State Department, administration after administration has convinced themselves that Turkey is an ally of extreme strategic importance, even though the record over the course of the last 20 plus years or so would suggest that the Turks do not like to be part of an American-led order in the region, and actually believe that the exercise of American power is not consistent with Turkey's interests. And the Turks have undermined any number of American efforts and initiatives in and around Turkey over the course of the last 2 decades. But nevertheless, the policy of administration to administration essentially boils down to what one senior Obama administration official once said to me with regard to Turkey: you get what you get, and you don't get upset. So they can engage in sanctions evasion, sure, but if we're nice to them, maybe they'll help us out on some other issue. Maybe, yes, we know that they're tight with Hamas, but maybe we can convince them to use their good offices with Hamas to force a change in Hamas policy. Let's see how well that has gone. All these kinds of ideas where where the United States bends over backwards for this ally of utmost strategic importance, and the Turks pocket that goodwill and continue to pursue their interests as they see fit, which is often in contradiction with American interests and American values.
And that's deeply frustrating to me. But I mean, I think the ace in the hole for the Turks is the base in central Turkey, Incirlik, right? That's the thing that we need probably more than everything else. I mean, people talk a lot about the geography of Turkey and how it serves as a buffer between East and West, or I'm not even sure. But I mean, it's the base, right? Is that what it all boils down to, or is it more than that?
Right. The Incirlik was incredibly important during the Cold War because it was close to the Soviet Union. It has become important once again to the United States in the fight against the Islamic State. Yet, let me point out that in 2014 and 2015, the Turks forced the United States to negotiate for a year to use Incirlik to engage in military operations against the Islamic State. They restricted the United States to intelligence gathering from that base rather than actually going out and bombing the Islamic State. That is a base where the United States has 90 nuclear weapons as a symbol of America's commitment to Turkish security. Yet the Turks wouldn't really play ball with us on the Islamic State because their priority was killing Kurds and killing Kurdish nationalists who were actually helping the United States in Syria fight the Islamic State. This is these levels of complexity with this relationship. Yet no one in any administration in the last 15 years has been willing to talk tough to the Turks about how they willfully undermine American policy, while at the same time, here's the United States, a symbol, our ultimate symbol of our commitment to their security is at Incirlik Air Base, yet they restrict our operations out of there.
And I'll remind our viewers and listeners that during the 2016 attempted coup in Turkey, the Turks actually shut down the base. Some people have tried to actually breach the base. These were people that were encouraged by the government. The kinds of threats that have been issued against some of the American servicemen that have been based at Incirlik, some of the beatings that have taken place, the threats, all of it is a murky picture that I think we have yet to somehow clarify. But let me just give you one more question before I let you go. There are some voices in Washington. I think you and I have just laid out a pretty damning case against the government in Ankara, but there are voices in Washington that continue to insist that the Turkish regime is somehow useful to us beyond Incirlik. Are these people credible? What's their argument, and how do you respond?
Some of them are credible, but not credible on the question of Turkey. Others are essentially shills for the Turkish government. And they basically repeat Turkish talking points, which is that Turkey is important, a reset between the United States and Turkey, in which the United States agrees to see things through Ankara's lens on every issue, and that we should allow them to, undermine our policy on Russia and in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. And what we would be buying as a result of this is stability in the region. I'm not sure how we get there by acquiescing to Turkey's position with regard to Iran, Russia, HTS, Hamas. It doesn't make any sense based on the facts of the case to suggest in any way, shape, or form that Turkey is a staunch partner of the United States, or that if the United States changed its policy on a variety of these issues, that Turkey would be more supportive of U.S. interests. Forget the whole values thing. We don't share values with this government in Turkey. I think everything that's happening on the streets of major cities in Turkey right now underline that. But the whole idea here is that the United States and Turkey share common interests. I don't see it at all. And it raises a whole host of suspicions about those folks who are out there parroting the Turkish line on these issues.
Suspicions indeed. All right. Thank you, Stephen Cook, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Ivana Skradner's piece in The Hill examines reports that Washington may lift sanctions on the Russian state-owned media outlet RT. You've probably seen RT if you've stayed at a hotel anywhere in the United States. She warns that doing so would be a grave misstep. She stresses that the U.S. must not conflate a commitment to free speech with giving leeway to adversaries waging information warfare on Americans. In the Washington Times, FDD's VP for Communications, Beth Robbins, explores the decline of the broadcasting network Voice of America. She looks back on the 1994 firewall that left it unaccountable and driven by staff biases. In light of Trump's recent VOA cuts, Beth argues that now is the moment to rebuild this once respectable outlet, starting with dismantling that firewall and restoring oversight. Finally, FDD's Cleo Pascal recently testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on the Indo-Pacific's critical role as it relates to U.S. strategic interests. As Beijing asserts its ambitions to dominate the region, Cleo underscores the urgent need for America to push back, not only to protect Taiwan and other Pacific nations. This is what will safeguard the future of U.S. influence across the entire region. And that's all she wrote for today, folks. If you're craving more information, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please consider supporting our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Our donors make this work possible. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We'll keep dishing you those headlines and providing our analysis. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.